I am Daniel Lupis,
And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
and welcome to Sex 101. Sex 101 is created to empower our sexes and, of course, our relationships. Another week, another great episode. Thirst and Grace, a sexual theology from John chapter 4.
This is the famous verse and section about Jesus and the woman at the well, which is really deep and there's much to be said about it. And today we're diving deep into one of the most profound encounters in the Gospels, Jesus and the woman at the well, and what it teaches about sexual redemption and healing in our dating relationships. Early Christianity inadvertently created the virgin whore dichotomy. But okay, what does healthy sexual redemption actually look like? And honestly, there's no place better to start than John chapter 4, because this story dismantles every category we've inherited about sexual shame, gender roles, and spiritual worthiness.
Indeed, worthiness. Before we dive in, let's set the scene, Mr. Meg. This is not just any conversation, it's a revolutionary on multiple levels. What makes these encounters so theologically significant?
The Greek text enriches our understanding of the theological significance of this encounter, illustrating themes of grace, redemption, and the breaking down of cultural barriers. This passage serves as a profound example of how Jesus offers not just physical needs, but also spiritual fulfillment. To understand why this conversation was so radical, we need to grasp just how many social boundaries Jesus crossed in a single afternoon. First, the geographical context. Jesus deliberately chose to travel through Samaria, a region most Jews avoided entirely. The animosity between Jews and Samaritans went back centuries. They were considered not just ethnically impure, but religiously heretical. The early church fathers understood this significance. John Chrysostom, writing in the late 4th century, emphasized that Jesus could have easily taken the longer route around Samaria, as most Jewish travelers did. But John 4:4 says he had to go through Samaria. Chrysostom interprets this divine necessity not as geographical convenience, but as redemptive mission. Christ deliberately seeking out the marginalized and sexually compromised. Augustine, in his tractates on John, notes the symbolic timing. It was about the 6th hour, noon, the hottest part of the day, when no respectable woman would draw water. Women typically came to wells in the cool of morning or evening, creating natural community spaces. This woman's isolation speaks volumes about her social status. She's avoiding other women, likely due to a sexual scandal. The gender dynamics are equally shocking. Jewish rabbinical tradition from the Mishnah explicitly forbade men from speaking to women in public, even their own wives. The Talmud contains numerous warnings about the spiritual dangers of casual conversation with women. Yet Jesus initiates this conversation, asking for water, a request that creates intimacy and obligation. But here's what's most revolutionary. Jesus doesn't just speak to a woman, he speaks to a sexually compromised woman. The text reveals she's had 5 husbands and is currently living with a man who isn't her husband. In the 1st century, in the area that the Romans dubbed Palestine, this represents either extraordinary tragedy, women becoming widowed repeatedly, or sexual impropriety. Given her isolation and the narrative context, the latter seems more likely. Jerome, in his biblical commentaries, suggests this woman represents the ultimate other, ethnically foreign, religiously heretical, socially ostracized, and sexually irregular. Every category that should have made her untouchable to a Jewish rabbi. Yet Jesus not only engages her, but offers her living water, the same spiritual gift he offers to religiously respectable figures like Nicodemus. The well itself carries profound sexual symbolism in Hebrew scripture. Wells are where marriages begin. Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, Moses and Zipporah, they represent places of covenant, intimacy, and new beginnings. That Jesus meets this sexually broken woman at a well suggests the possibility of a new kind of relationship, a healing of her capacity for intimacy. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, developed elaborate allegorical interpretations of this passage, but his literal analysis is equally profound. He notes that Jesus doesn't condemn her sexual history, doesn't demand immediate moral reform, and doesn't even explicitly call her to repentance. Instead, he offers her dignity through theological conversation, treating her as intellectually capable of understanding deep spiritual truths. In conclusion, the historical and cultural context reveals that Jesus deliberately sought out the most marginalized woman possible to demonstrate that sexual brokenness doesn't disqualify anyone from divine love or spiritual significance.
Mr. Mix, that's fascinating. Jesus actually choosing to engage with someone represents everything his culture told him to avoid. But let's dig deeper into conversation itself. What's happening theologically when they start talking about living water?
The theology of thirst, we could say, the conversation about living water is where Jesus reveals something revolutionary about human desire itself. When he says, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst," he's not just talking about physical or even spiritual refreshment. He's addressing the deeper issue of insatiable longing that drives much of human behavior, including sexual behavior. Augustine, in his Confessions, wrote that famous line about human hearts being restless until they find rest in God. But in his commentary on John, he develops this further, arguing that sexual desire, when disordered, becomes a symptom of deeper spiritual thirst. The woman's five marriages aren't just moral failures, they represent a pattern of seeking ultimate fulfillment in human relationships that can't bear that weight. This is crucial for dating couples today. How often do we place romantic or sexual relationships under the pressure to satisfy needs only God can meet? When we expect our partner to be our ultimate source of security, meaning, or validation, we create what psychologists call anxious attachment and what Augustine would call disordered love. John Chrysostom preached extensively on this passage, emphasizing that Jesus doesn't shame the woman for her thirst, physical or metaphorical. Instead, he directs it. The Greek word Jesus uses for living water is hydroxon, literally water that lives. This suggests not just one time spiritual experience, but an ongoing source of inner refreshment that doesn't run dry. Think about the psychological implications. This woman has likely spent years believing that her worth depends on male approval and sexual desirability. Each relationship failure reinforces her shame and drives her to seek validation in the next man. It's a cycle that leaves her increasingly isolated and desperate. But Jesus offers her a different source of identity and fulfillment. The living water represents the possibility of finding primary satisfaction in divine love, which then frees her to engage in human relationships from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. Ambrose of Milan, in his writings on virginity, often gets interpreted as anti sexual, but his analysis of this passage is more nuanced. He argues that the woman's multiple relationships reveal not excessive sexuality, but insufficient understanding of what she truly needs. She's looking for living water in broken cisterns, to use Jeremiah's metaphor. This has profound implications for modern dating. When we enter relationships trying to get our deepest needs met through another person, we create dynamics of codependency, jealousy, and emotional manipulation. But when we come to relationships from a place of spiritual fullness, we can offer genuine love rather than need based attachment. The Hebrew concept of nephesh, often translated as soul, refers to the totality of human desire and longing. Sexual desire is part of this, but it's not separate from spiritual longing. They're interconnected. When spiritual thirst goes unmet, sexual desire can become compulsive, seeking transcendence through physical intimacy. Origen's mystical interpretation suggests that the five husbands represent the five senses through which we seek satisfaction in the material world. The current man who is not her husband represents false spirituality, religious or philosophical systems that promise fulfillment but can't deliver lasting satisfaction. Only Christ, the true bridegroom, can satisfy the soul's deepest longings. Modern psychology confirms this ancient wisdom. Attachment theory shows that our capacity for healthy, intimate relationships depends on having secure attachment to something larger than ourselves. When people lack that secure base, what Christians might call a relationship with God, they often seek it through romantic relationships, creating cycles of intensity followed by disappointment. The woman's response, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water," reveals both her spiritual hunger and her practical exhaustion. She's tired of the endless cycle of seeking, finding, losing, and seeking again. She's ready for something that actually satisfies. In conclusion, the theology of thirst reveals that sexual and romantic longing, while good in themselves, can become disordered when we expect them to satisfy needs only divine love can meet, but that proper spiritual fulfillment actually enhances our capacity for healthy human intimacy.
Mr. Meg, this idea of living water as an internal source that free us for healthy relationships is powerful. But then the conversation takes a dramatic turn when Jesus brings up her marital history. How should we understand this moment?
This is where the encounter becomes both deeply personal and universally applicable. When Jesus says, "Go, call your husband and come back," he's not making casual conversation. He's moving toward the heart of her shame and brokenness. And her response, "I have no husband," is both technically true and completely evasive. Augustine analyzes this exchange with psychological precision that wouldn't be out of place in a modern counseling textbook. He notes that the woman is practicing what we might call selective disclosure, revealing just enough truth to avoid an outright lie, but withholding the full reality that would expose her shame. Jesus' response is masterful. "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." He acknowledges her partial honesty while gently bringing the full truth into the light. This is truth telling without condemnation, exposure without humiliation. Jerome's commentary emphasizes that Jesus doesn't elaborate on the details of her sexual history or demand explanations. He simply states the facts and moves forward. This reveals something crucial about divine love. It knows us completely and loves us anyway. There's no need for defensiveness or elaborate justifications. For dating couples, this moment illustrates the necessity and difficulty of honest communication about our sexual and relational histories. How often do we practice the same selective disclosure the Samaritan woman used? We reveal just enough to seem authentic while protecting ourselves from potential rejection or judgment. But notice what happens when the truth comes out. The woman doesn't run away. She doesn't become defensive or angry. Instead, she recognizes Jesus as a prophet and immediately shifts the conversation to deeper theological questions. Truth telling, when done with love rather than condemnation, creates space for deeper intimacy rather than destroying it. John Chrysostom preaches that this woman becomes a model for what he calls holy boldness, the courage to engage in spiritual conversation even while carrying sexual shame. This doesn't disqualify her from theological inquiry. She asks about worship, about the Messiah, about the differences between Jewish and Samaritan religious practice. This is psychologically profound. Shames typically makes us hide, withdraw, or become aggressive in self-defense. But when we encounter love that knows our truth and doesn't reject us, shame begins to lose its power. The woman experiences what modern psychology calls earned security, the healing that happens when someone sees us fully and still chooses a relationship. Ambrose of Milan notes that Jesus doesn't require moral reform before spiritual conversation. He doesn't say, "First go end that unmarried relationship, then come back and we'll talk theology." The offer of living water comes before behavioral change, not after. This challenges both legalistic and permissive approaches to sexual ethics. The sequence is crucial. Divine acceptance enables transformation, not the reverse. When people feel secure in unconditional love, they become free to change. When change is demanded as the price of acceptance, it either breeds resentment or superficial compliance. For modern dating relationships, this means creating safety for truth telling about sexual histories, past relationships, struggles with pornography, or other areas of shame. Partners need to be able to say, "This is my story, including the parts I'm not proud of," without fear of rejection or ongoing judgment. But it also means taking responsibility for our stories. The woman doesn't make excuses or blame her circumstances. She simply states the truth when directly asked. Taking ownership of our choices without excessive self condemnation or elaborate justifications creates the foundation for genuine intimacy. Origen's allegorical interpretation suggests that the five husbands represent different attempts to find ultimate meaning, perhaps through career success, family approval, financial security, physical pleasure, and social status. The current non husband might represent a spiritual search that lacks commitment, trying various religious or philosophical approaches without full dedication. The woman's immediate recognition of Jesus as a prophet suggests that truth telling opens spiritual perception. When we're hiding from our reality, we're also hiding from God's presence. But honesty creates clarity, both about ourselves and about a divine love. The early church fathers consistently emphasize that this woman becomes the first Gentile evangelist in John's gospel. After her encounter with Jesus, she returns to her city and brings others to meet him. Sexual brokenness, when healed through divine encounter, doesn't disqualify ministry, it becomes part of the testimony. In conclusion, the revelation of truth demonstrates that healing from sexual shame requires honest acknowledgement of our stories, received within relationships that offer divine acceptance, creating freedom for both personal transformation and ministry to others.
So the path forward is not avoiding the conversation about our sexual histories, but creating space for honest dialogue with accepting relationships. But then the woman raises questions about worship and religious differences. Why does she shift from personal and theological topics?
The woman's shift from personal revelation to theological inquiry reveals something profound about how healing from sexual shame actually works. She doesn't remain stuck in self analysis or continue discussing her relational failures. Instead, she immediately moves towards questions about God, worship, and spiritual truth. This progression from thirst to truth telling to theology maps the journey from sexual brokenness to spiritual wholeness. Augustine observes that once divine love has touched our shame without rejecting us, we naturally become curious about the nature of God. The woman asks, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." She's not changing the subject to avoid her personal issues. She's recognizing that her personal healing is connected to larger questions about spiritual reality. John Chrysostom notes the sophistication of her theological question. She's asking about the relationship between Jewish and Samaritan religious traditions, about the proper location and form of worship, and about ancestral authority versus contemporary practice. These aren't casual inquiries. They reveal a woman who's been thinking deeply about spiritual matters despite her complicated personal life. This challenges the assumption that sexual irregularity disqualifies theological engagement. The early church fathers consistently emphasize that this woman demonstrates remarkable spiritual insight. She recognizes Jesus as a prophet, engages in complex theological discussion, and ultimately identifies him as the Messiah. Her sexual history doesn't diminish her spiritual capacity. For dating couples, this suggests that past sexual experiences, whether positive or negative, don't disqualify ongoing spiritual growth or ministry. In fact, the integration of sexual and spiritual identity might enhance rather than hinder our understanding of divine love, human nature, and the need for redemption. Jesus' response is equally revolutionary. A time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. This isn't just theological instruction, it's personal healing. Jesus is telling this sexually broken, ethnically marginalized, religiously heretical woman that she can become exactly the kind of worshiper God desires. Location doesn't matter, ethnic background doesn't matter, Sexual history doesn't matter. What matters is spiritual authenticity and truth. Jerome's commentary emphasizes that worship in spirit and in truth requires the integration of inner reality and outer expression. The woman can't worship authentically while hiding behind shame or pretending to be someone she's not, but neither can she remain trapped in self condemnation. True worship emerges from the intersection of divine grace and human honesty. Ambrose of Milan connects this passage to his broader theology of spiritual transformation. He argues that worship is both the goal and the means of healing. As we offer authentic worship, acknowledging both our brokenness and God's love, we're gradually transformed into the image of what we worship. This has profound implications for how Christian dating couples approach spiritual intimacy. Shared worship becomes a space where both partners can bring their full selves, including sexual histories, current struggles, hopes, and fears, before God together. It's not about presenting perfect spiritual facades, but about an authentic encounter with divine love. The progression in this woman's story reveals how identity transformation actually works. She begins as someone defined by her sexual relationships and social ostracism. She ends as someone who can speak with authority about the Messiah's identity and bring her entire community to encounter him. Her past becomes part of her testimony rather than her disqualification. Origen develops an elaborate typological interpretation where the woman represents the church itself, initially unfaithful but ultimately transformed into the bride of Christ. Her five husbands represent humanity's various attempts as false worship throughout history. Her current non husband represents the law, which has authority but can't provide the satisfaction of true marriage. Only Christ can become the true bridegroom who satisfies the soul's deepest longings. The psychological insight here is profound. Shame keeps us focused on ourselves, our failures, our inadequacies, our need for approval or validation. But worship shifts our focus from self absorption to divine reality. As we become absorbed in the glory and love of God, shame naturally begins to diminish. We're not trying to overcome shame directly, we're being transformed by beholding divine beauty. Modern neuroscience confirms this ancient wisdom. Practices of worship, gratitude, and meditation literally rewire our brains, reducing activity in areas associated with self criticism and increasing activity in areas associated with connection, compassion, and transcendence. For couples dealing with sexual shame from past relationships, addiction, abuse, or other experiences, shared worship can become a powerful healing practice. It creates space to encounter unconditional love together, to experience identity beyond personal history, and to envision transformation that exceeds what neither partner could achieve individually. The woman's theological engagement also demonstrates intellectual dignity. Despite her compromised social status, Jesus treats her as capable of sophisticated spiritual conversation. This challenges both ancient and modern tendencies to reduce sexually active women to their physical experiences, denying their intellectual and spiritual capacities. In conclusion, the movement from shame to worship reveals that healing from sexual brokenness involves not just personal acceptance, but spiritual transformation, where encounter with divine love gradually reshapes our identity from being defined by our past to being defined by our capacity for authentic relationship with God.
So the path forward is not avoiding the conversation about our sexual histories, but creating space for honest dialogue within accepting relationships. But when woman raises the question about worship and religious differences, why does the shift from personal theological topics?
And here, what has remarkable is that Jesus treats her as a full person, sexually, intellectually, and spiritually. And it comes the climax of the conversation because she mentions the Messiah. And this is Jesus' self revelation to complete her transformation. The woman's statement, I know that Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us, represents both hope and resignation. She's acknowledging that her deepest questions about worship, identity, and spiritual truth will someday be answered, but not yet. It's the response of someone who's learned to live with uncertainty and incompleteness. Jesus' reply, I, the one speaking to you, am he, is the most direct messianic claim in John's gospel. He reveals his identity more clearly to the sexually compromised Samaritan woman than he does to the religious leaders in Jerusalem. This isn't accidental, it's a theological revolution. Augustine interprets this moment as the culmination of divine pedagogy. Throughout this conversation, Jesus had been gradually revealing himself, first as a Jewish man who breaks social conventions, then as someone who offers living water, then as a prophet who sees truth, and finally as the Messiah himself. Each revelation builds on the previous one, creating a crescendo of divine self disclosure. But notice the intimate context. I, the one speaking to you, am He. The Greek emphasizes personal relationship. That is, I'm not just the Messiah, it's I am the one who has been talking with you, seeing you, accepting you, offering you living water. The messianic identity is revealed through personal relationship, not theological abstraction. John Chrysostom emphasizes that this woman receives the first explicit revelation of Christ's messianic identity in the fourth gospel. Not Nicodemus, the respected teacher of Israel, not John the Baptist, the prophetic forerunner, not even the disciples who are still figuring out who Jesus really is. The sexually broken, ethnically marginalized, religiously heretical woman gets the clearest revelation of divine identity. This challenges every assumption about spiritual worthiness. In first century Judaism, women couldn't serve as legal witnesses. Their testimony wasn't considered reliable, and sexually compromised women were particularly suspect. Yet Jesus chooses this woman to be the first recipient and proclaimer of his messianic identity. Jerome notes the psychological impact of this revelation on the woman. She doesn't respond with theological questions or requests for proof. She immediately leaves her water jar and runs to the city to tell others. The physical detail of abandoning her water jar is symbolically rich. She came seeking water, but found the source of living water. Her original errand becomes irrelevant in light of her spiritual discovery. For dating couples, this moment illustrates how divine love reframes our understanding of worthiness and calling. We might assume that past sexual experiences disqualify us from spiritual significance or ministry effectiveness, but Jesus' choice to reveal himself most clearly to this woman suggests the opposite. Divine love seeks out those who understand their need for grace. Ambrose of Milan develops this theme extensively in his sermons. He argues that the woman's sexual history doesn't hinder her evangelistic effectiveness, it enhances it. When she tells her neighbors, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did," her transparency about her past becomes part of her testimony. She's not hiding her history, she's demonstrating how divine love transforms it into ministry. The early church fathers consistently identify this woman as the first successful evangelist in John's gospel. Her testimony brings the entire city to encounter Jesus. Many believe in him initially because of her word, and after meeting him personally, they declare, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." Origen's mystical interpretation suggests that the woman represents the soul's journey from spiritual adultery to mystical marriage. Her five husbands represent the five senses through which we seek satisfaction in created things. Her current non husband represents false spirituality, but an encounter with Christ transforms her into a true bride, one who can bring others into a relationship with the divine bridegroom. This has profound implications for understanding sexual redemption. The goal isn't to erase our sexual histories or pretend they don't matter. The goal is integration, allowing divine love to transform our stories, including the painful parts, into testimonies of grace and healing. Modern psychology recognizes this as post traumatic growth, the way difficult experiences, when processed through supportive relationships, can actually enhance our capacity for compassion, wisdom, and service to others. The woman's sexual brokenness, healed through an encounter with Christ, becomes the foundation for effective ministry. The timing of this revelation is also significant. It comes after truth telling, but before moral reform. Jesus reveals his messianic identity to her while she's still living with a man who isn't her husband. Divine love doesn't wait for us to clean up our act. It meets us in our brokenness and begins transformation from the inside out. For contemporary dating relationships, this suggests that spiritual growth and sexual healing can happen simultaneously rather than sequentially. Couples don't need to achieve perfect sexual purity before engaging in serious spiritual development. Instead, a deepening relationship with God provides the foundation for healthy sexuality and relational maturity. The woman's evangelistic success also challenges gendered assumptions about ministry and testimony. In a culture where women's voices were generally discounted, especially in religious matters, her testimony carries weight because of its authenticity and the evident transformation in her life. The disciples return and they're surprised at finding Jesus talking with a woman provide contrast. They've been with Jesus for months, but still don't understand his radical inclusiveness. The woman, after one conversation, becomes a more effective evangelist than the 12 men who've been following her. This passage is extraordinarily rich, and there is much to be said about it. In conclusion, Jesus' self revelation as Messiah demonstrates that divine love seeks out those who understand their need for grace, transforms sexual brokenness into evangelistic effectiveness, and reveals that spiritual calling depends not on moral perfection, but on authentic encounter with divine love.
It's remarkable how Jesus treats her as a full person, sexually, intellectually, spiritually, but then comes the climax of the conversation when she mentions the Messiah. How does Jesus' self revelation complete her transformation?
And here's what we have is this very understanding of the Messiah as revealed. She is saying that the Messiah is coming and he explains everything. And he then says, I'm that one who is speaking to you. And this is where we see the culmination of the entire passage. He's saying it clearly and completely. He's not just the Messiah, but he's the one who's been talking, accepting, and offering living water. And this is where we find the full fulfillment in not the religious leaders of the day, like Nicodemus, but actually a woman who is religiously heretical and someone who is not expected to accept that type of identity. This challenges everything that we know because what we understand is that a woman who is compromised is the first person who reveals who Jesus actually is. Now, this is divine love, which understands grace and grace from him directly. Early church fathers also notice this and say that here's the woman who tells everyone else the first real clear explanation of his messiahship in John's gospel. His encounter with her now says that everything is past. The goal is not the future, and the future is now more positive as a result with the living water that he offers. She came and looked for moral reform, not first, but afterwards. Divine love doesn't ask us to clean up our act, but it says to reveal the divine love, which will be transformative. The woman's evangelistic success then says and challenges everything we know about gender relations in the ancient world and for the present. The woman doesn't have to change immediately, but she goes and recognizes him to tell the rest of the city. When she goes back to the city, they come running and hear for themselves. They return and surprise the disciples themselves. The ones who had been following Jesus didn't understand him. This disordered woman, who was ethnically compromised and sexually compromised, is the one who recognized him. That's what was so revolutionary and so rich about this particular passage. In one conversation, she becomes the ultimate witness, someone that they don't expect, and someone that was not following him for months. This passage is really rich, and there's much to be said and will continue to be celebrated. In conclusion, Jesus' self revelation as the Messiah demonstrates that the person who is even the most marginalized, the most outsider status, is that person who becomes the most effective. And in fact, becomes more effective because of her past and because of her outside nature. Spiritual calling, in conclusion, depends not on finding moral perfection first, but coming with a direct encounter with divine love in the person of Jesus.
Divine love indeed. Thirst and Grace, a sexually theology from John chapter 4 explores a powerful encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, transforming a moment of physical thirst into profound dialogue about spiritual longing, intimacy, and grace. Mr. Mike, very well said. And would you like to plug in something?
Sure, if you don't mind, I appreciate it. Write the book, go the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Doctor of Digital Smith, PhD. Also, listen to the Doctor of Digital podcast and also pick up a couple volumes on Amazon. That is Burning America and On Track Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Make the Doctor Digital because if you support him for sure, more and more empowering episode of the podcast, and for sure, more and more empowering authors to come. And please do listen to our baby podcast, people. Our baby podcast, Mental Health 101. Mental Health 101 is created for our mental health awareness. So, Mr. Bank, thank you so much for your time.
And until next time, Deus Volt.
More to come, people. See you soon.